Good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us on This Week in Cincinnati. I'm Tanya O'Rourke. It has been well documented that many slaves seeking freedom made it to Ohio or other northern states along the Underground Railroad. Cincinnati and many other Ohio River cities have rich stories to tell, including the village of New Richmond. WCPO 9 News reporter Lisa Smith went there to talk to residents about the community's abolitionist roots.
When settled in 1814 by Jacob Light, they called this little river town New Richmond after Richmond, Virginia. The difference, Virginia was a slave state. Ohio wasn't.
I believe that this little village has every bit of the Underground Railroad history that other river towns that are a little more notorious for it have.
Greg Roberts is the New Richmond village administrator and a village historian. He says there are historical markers all around New Richmond, some designated by the National Park Service's National Underground Railroad Network to Freedom, to note the significant roles villagers played.
The Ohio River became symbolic as the River Jordan. And once you cross that river, you're into freedom.
Howell Boone, my great-great-grandfather, and his wife came here in the 1850s.
Mary Allen still lives in New Richmond more than 170 years after her ancestors arrived.
Even though he was a slave, he knew he was treated a little differently, and that when he was an adult, he was given his freedom. And so he came here.
Allen has done extensive research on African-American families in New Richmond, hers and about 60 others.
Let's say 1870 and 1900, there was probably 100 families. There may have been 18% of the population, maybe as high as 20, were African Americans.
Some believe one reason why African Americans went to New Richmond was because it was known to be an abolitionist stronghold. James Burney was a well-known abolitionist newspaper editor.
He came to New Richmond, and his own quotes were because he knew he'd be protected here. New Richmond was known as a hellhole of abolitionists in those days.
The clashes are documented.
They weren't just playing around. When they said they'd kill you, they would.
Lisa Smith, WCPO 9 News.
I'm thrilled that I'm joined by two of the people you just saw in that story, genealogist Mary Allen and New Richmond's village administrator Greg Roberts, and a bit of a historian as well. Thanks so much for being here. We've been sitting here talking, and I remember when Lisa's story first aired, and I thought, what? New Richmond was this abolitionist stronghold and part of the Underground Railroad in a way that I didn't realize. Are you finding that people were surprised too? Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Because unfortunately, Claremont County and New Richmond isn't today noted as a extremely diverse community.
Right. I mean, thank you for stating that, because I was thinking, wait a minute now. So you have lived in New Richmond all of your life?
I've lived there except for 15 years. I grew up there, I went to school there, and my great-great-grandfather came in the mid-1850s.
And your great-great-grandfather was the descendant of a plantation owner and
a slave. And our oral history was that he was treated a little differently than the other slave children, and obviously he was educated and given a certain amount of money because he came to New Richmond as a free man, and he had a store and a livery in New Richmond, and it was a thriving business.
A hellhole of abolitionism. Explain that quote to me. Someone said that in that story, and it wasn't either of you, but that's what New Richmond was known as at that time. Why?
Well, primarily because there were a number of abolitionists that were outspoken. And it's not to necessarily say that they were the majority of people in town, because this is southern Ohio, and culturally no difference really then in the 19th century as it is today, east side of the river. But community leaders, there was basically a cadre of community leaders that were educated and open-minded, and some who believed in the words of our founding documents in terms of all men being created equal, and they practiced those beliefs and created a welcoming community for people who were seeking freedom. You
talk about that as a welcoming community for people seeking freedom. Do you have any documentation that talks about like what that was like, for folks of color to cross the Ohio River into New Richmond and be welcomed?
I think that it would be, an example would be Howell Boone's store. The corner was called Boone's Corner.
And that's your family.
It was, but he sold to black and white families. When I go back through the census records, prior to the Civil War, only free men were shown and whites were shown in the census records, but you can look at the names and you can look at the addresses, and in New Richmond, even in the 1850s, 1860s, you would have like 3 or 4 black families, 5 or 6 white families, 6, I mean, they were sprinkled all through the neighborhoods, and I didn't live during that period, but I have family. We've consistently lived in New Richmond since the 1850s, someone from my family. And I mean, my great-grandmother graduated from New Richmond High School in 1893.
And I mean, to think about that, a black woman graduated from high school before the high schools were integrated.
Exactly, yes. And so it's interesting to me when I see things like that, and this was in a yearbook, so I have evidence. It existed, and I was told that she did. But when you see some of those examples, you think there was diversity in New Richmond long before it was a popular thing, and people seem to do quite well in that environment.
That's just awesome. I am curious. Since Lisa's story aired, have you had more people going, I didn't know this about New Richmond? I mean, besides me.
Oh,
because
absolutely.
I grew up in Finneytown and I had did you know? I didn't know.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's not just New Richmond, but all of Claremont County. The Underground Railroad network, they worked together secretly to help enslaved people reach freedom to Canada at the time before the Civil War. And so this has been hidden history for some time, and a good friend of mine did this research almost 20 years ago. His name is Gary Knepp. He's a local attorney, just named our honorary Claremont County historian, did yeoman's work in terms of uncovering all this great history, and we're all very indebted, myself particularly, for the work that Gary did.
I want to talk more about how it really did occur when we come back. And we're also going to have much more with these folks. We're going to take a look at what historical archives revealed about one tri-state town's efforts to end slavery in America. Today we are looking at the rich African-American history of New Richmond. Some may not be familiar with the role of this Claremont County village and what it played, that role it played in the abolitionist movement in the early 1800s. I'm so thrilled that Mary Allen and New Richmond's village administrator, Greg Roberts, could stick around with me because I want to talk about this. I think some people, you hear the Underground Railroad and you think this is a railroad. It's not. So explain to me what was it, in terms that we can all understand, what was happening for these folks making their way from slave states?
Well, of course, the Underground Railroad is a metaphor. It wasn't underground, and it wasn't a railroad. But the term was coined, I think, with association with our sister village of Ripley, Ohio, when an escaped freedom seeker came across the river and went on to the again, using the metaphor, the line that went through Ripley and through John Rankin, and basically disappeared. And the slave catchers said it was as if they disappeared on an underground railroad.
You literally cross over the Ohio River, which is the Mason-Dixon line, essentially,
Yes.
right? And so people were housed along the way. There were safe homes, so to speak, right?
Right. But one of the things that I think is not well understood, and Mary's family, their existence in New Richmond and a sizable African-American population there before the Civil War, that's one of the hallmarks of most of these towns and villages along the river. They had an African-American community, and those people oftentimes are the unsung, undocumented heroes on the Underground Railroad.
In fact, there's something called the Union Association, which I have no idea. Mary, please enlighten all of us.
There was a group of 22 plus men, black men, who created a group called the Union Association for the Advancement of the Colored Men of New Richmond, Ohio.
Wow, it is. Yeah, you don't say that easily.
And so my great-great-grandfather, Howell Boone, was the treasurer, but these men were blacksmiths, they were horsemen, they were men, barbers, ministers, and they basically created this group to support each other and recognize my ancestor came as a free man, but there were men who came as slaves. And so this group embraced others and they acted like a savings and loan to its members. But
Is that it right there?
they had, that's the church.
Yeah.
So this group formed both the AME Church and the Second Baptist Church. And this is my ancestor, and these are just some people that I researched during the bicentennial. But you know, you look at people came, but when they came, there was no place to stay, and then they didn't know how to blend in.
Sure.
So there was this
Because they
group-
would stick out.
They
right?
would stick
Let's be
out,
honest.
right?
Yes.
And so, but I could go tell the story of Leroy Lee, who came across the Ohio. His mother was living in New Richmond at the time and working. We believe he was from a large farm in Kentucky and probably stayed a little too long, and the slave catchers came looking for him. And this is noted. We have an Underground Railroad sign and a sign that's documented from the National Registry, but it acknowledges that he was here. The slave catchers came to find him, to take him back to Kentucky, and the abolitionists in New Richmond said, not in our town. And this huge mob developed, and they chased the slave catchers.
Unbelievable. I should mention there are historical markers all over New Richmond. If you want to go and check things out, you really should go there, go Ripley, just to understand more.
Sure.
But I want to ask you before we have to go in this block. We talked about historical archives, which revealed really the town's efforts to help end slavery. Can you talk about that?
Well, not everyone in New Richmond was abolitionist or anti-slavery. But another component of their beliefs of this core group of people was that they believed wholeheartedly in the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. And so they provided protection to James Burney to publish his anti-slavery paper. Not necessarily
The
because
philanthropist,
the
right?
philanthropist, not just because they were anti-slavery, but they believed that Mr. Burney had every right to say what he thought about the institution of slavery, and were willing to protect him and provide a vigilante group to, and there were at least 2 occasions where there were threats of pro-slavery mobs that come and attack his press. And just a short year after these threats on Burney, a newspaper publisher in Alton, Illinois was killed.
Wow.
His name was Elijah P. Lovejoy, and that kind of garnered understanding from people who were maybe on the fence about the issue of slavery. They said, well, if the pro-slavery people will go to this measure of violence and kill someone, that maybe we ought to look a little harder about what's going on here.
That's fantastic. I got to tell you guys, I'm so blown away by all of this information. It's so fascinating. Go to New Richmond, check it out. You must be so incredibly proud of your community and its rich history, truly. Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Coming up next, representation matters. Having a teacher who looks like you can change everything. There are too few teachers of color. How local schools are working to change that.
Now through Monday.
As WCPO 9 News celebrates Black History Month, we are honoring Black leaders in education then and now. And we're looking at a lack of Black men who are educators and how schools are trying to fix that. Here's anchor Evan Millward.
Today we know Peter Clark because of Hyde Park's Clark Montessori.
But I never really knew that he was an African-American male.
The students there
He became the first African-American teacher teaching in segregated school systems.
want you to know more about him.
He was the first teacher engaged by the Cincinnati Black Public Schools in 1849.
Clark would inspire generations of Black teachers, ahead of his time maybe.
Make sure your hands are folded.
At Chase Elementary,
Make sure your mouth is quiet.
Roger Horton
How many
holds court
rockets do I have?
over kindergartners.
I do not like what you're doing. I do like what you're doing.
He made the move from 3rd grade a few years ago.
I had to learn to wipe noses and I had to learn to tie shoes, but ultimately I had to learn how to hug and I had to learn how to love.
There's one important thing he didn't have to learn, and he remembers how important it is for a child.
None of my teachers until my 3rd grade look like me, walk like me, or talk like me.
It is getting harder to hire teachers nationwide, but there is an especial shortage of African American educators, and Black male teachers are even harder to come by.
Oh, let me see.
3.3% of Kentucky teachers are Black, compared to 10.5% of students. In Ohio, it's 4% to 16.8%. Representation matters.
I see it and see it's that kind of like that self-talk. it becomes self-actualization, and they become very prideful in themselves.
So what's the fix? It is strategy 1 in the Ohio Education Department's long-term plan.
I do agree with that. I think there's a recruitment aspect that we should look at.
But it will take more than that. A University of Phoenix and National Network of State Teachers of the Year report also suggests more teacher prep programs and enriched experiences in school settings.
And Alonzo to play.
A strategy to reach kids like Alonzo Berry.
We never give up on each other.
He's part of the MORE program, Men Organized, Respectful, Educated. On this day, the boys learn chess.
Checkmate.
They're learning how to tie ties and build relationships that inspire. Maybe there's another Roger Horton in this group, or a Peter Clark. The numbers show we needed them then, and we still need them now. In Northside.
Great job, everybody.
I'm Evan Millward, WCPO 9 News.
You should note that national report is seen as a bit of a warning. It notes students of color who have teachers of color generally have a more positive view of school, fewer disciplinary problems, and higher test scores. You can read teacher testimonials on WCPO.com. A group of 4 black entrepreneurs are joining forces to open a new wellness center in the tri-state. The 4 businesses are opening up under one roof in Cincinnati's Short Vine neighborhood, selling candles, crystals, juice, and offering massages. The four call the space Pause. They say the idea is to pause, to focus on you.
You can get a candle, you can get some juice, you can get a massage, you can get plants, you can get crystals, energy readings. So we really want you to come in and just take some time for yourself.
So the storefront is part of the newest effort by Mortar, which is a nonprofit that helps minority business owners get into brick and mortar storefronts. This Week in Cincinnati is coming right back. Stay with us.
It's Watson's President's Day.
Cincinnati Mayor John Cranley tells the WCPO 9 newsroom that he is exploring a run to become Ohio's next governor in 2022. Cranley is the first candidate in Ohio to publicly announce that he's exploring a run for the governor's office. If he moves ahead with the campaign, he could face Democratic challengers in 2022 spring primary. The winner would likely face current Republican Governor Mike DeWine in November.
I've begun exploring whether it makes sense to run for governor because I know that Ohio can do a lot better. Candidly, for decades, Ohio's middle class has been shrinking under bad policies coming out of state government. Cincinnati has seen a comeback, and that, I think, is worth thinking about as a better way forward for Ohio.
Now, for a general election, Cranley may need to raise $20 million to boost his name recognition with voters from, like Cleveland and Columbus. The search is on to find Councilmember Amy Murray's replacement. Amy Murray has a little more than a month before she's sworn in as the Director of Small Business Programs for the Department of Defense. She plans to hold interviews for her replacement with the Hamilton County GOP. Murray is a minority on the council as both a female and a Republican. She hopes to find that same diversity moving forward.
I think it's important to have diversity on the city council, and I think it's important to have diversity of party. And so it's really important who we select.
Now, Murray says she does not have anyone in mind yet to replace her. The deadline to apply is Monday. Kentucky's ramping up its Real ID program ahead of an important deadline. The state just opened 4 more regional offices to issue the special licenses, and officials expect to open 12 to 14 more by early summer. Now, starting October 1st, you're going to need a new Real ID license to board domestic flights or enter U.S. military bases. Without a Real ID, you're going to have to use a passport. Kentucky's one of the last states to comply with the federal travel law, which was passed, by the way, 15 years ago. And that is This Week in Cincinnati for this Sunday. Join us for breaking news, weather, and sports at 6 and 11 tonight on WCPO 9 News. And we're always updating your headlines. You'll find them on WCPO.com.